Welcome to Barn Blog, and today I'm going to be applying some of the things that we've been talking about at Nailing It Down, about heteroglossia, the multivariance of concepts, the unfinalizability of concepts, to multipolarity, and also giving you its history. On one sense, the Marxist use of the term multipolarity is a total aberration. The concept of polarity, una, bi, and multi go back to the classical realist international relations school that emerged after World War I. Inspired by Thomas Hobbes, Thucydides, and Nicolas Machiavelli, and by an understanding of human nature as competition for power and mimetic desire, in the field of international relations being one of anarchy, where geography and power relations set the play, the theory of polarity was to understand the various ways in which nations could compete with one another. There were three polarities distinguished as types of systems: unipolarity, as manifested in the United States hegemony after World War II, British hegemony during the 19th century, Ming and Qing China hegemony in East Asia during their respective time periods, and during the Roman Empire's high point. Bipolarity was seen as manifested as the competitions between France and the US during the 7 Years' War, the competition between Spain and Portugal, and international colonialism, and the competition during the Cold War. And multipolarity was defined as more or less the default, with multiple great powers having lesser powers coalesce around them, in competition through minor proxy wars. The primary theorists of this were E.H. Carr, the British international relations thinker, and Hans Morgenthau, the German-American international relations thinker of the classical realist school. Now, the adoption of multipolarity on the left came largely after Fareed Zakaria, a journalist, wrote about these debates in a book called The Post-American World, America in a Multipolar World. Shortly thereafter, Dugin himself, in Russian, wrote what would be translated into The Fourth Political Theory and published in English in 2012, but was published in Russian a little bit after Zakaria's book. Now, when people have attacked me recently for saying, of course, no one thinks of multipolarity as 1914, that's not what we meant. Well, that's because they are reading the opposition to the situation of 1914 through Lenin, but then applying Lenin as if that is a multipolar argument, and it is not. Polarity and the establishment and maintenance of Maton states was not the concern of Lenin. Now, if you want to say that multipolarity has been rechristened and has a new meaning today, that may be true, but you have to deal with the prior meanings of the term. There are a few schools you need to understand that have nothing to do with Marxism to understand where this comes from. Furthermore, multipolarity is not multilateralism. The assumptions are different. And it is not anti-imperialism in and of itself either. Anti-imperialism and a multipolar worldview would be instrumental, not teleological, meaning one might be anti-imperial to oppose a great powers expansion so that your power can maintain its own expansion, but one would never actually assume that the goal of removing imperialism altogether was the purpose of a multipolar politics. But to understand this, we need to understand the classical realist school of Europe and America, and the neo-realist school that aimed in response to it in the 1970s, of which people who you might have heard of, such as Kenneth Waltz or John Mearsheimer, are themselves representative. The classical realist school, as we understand it, really emerged in Europe and the United States after World War I. Realism saw itself as an answer to the Hegelian debates and the ideotypology debates around liberal political and geopolitical relations theory prior to World War I. It is generally seen as being formulated between 1918 and 1939. Liberal scholars during the time period attributed conflict to poor social conditions and weak political systems, just like Marxists tend to do, and thought that international law and institutions, what today gets called in liberal parlance, the international rule of order, were developed along these lines. After realists in World War I critiqued this along the lines of the schools of polarity, and returned to early liberal figures such as Hobbes, Machiavelli, and a focus on Thucydides for their understanding of human nature. The assumption that fear and aggression were fundamental motivations were key assumptions for people like Hans Morgenthau. And the fact that the state of nature did exist between nations, even though the state and the nation state solved it between individuals, led Morgenthau to develop this more explicitly in 1948 in his book, Politics Among the Nations. Politics is governed by the objective laws that have their root in human nature, is Morgenthau's first assertion. All right, classical realists view the state as a unit of analysis and understand it as ontologically the structure of the international system, as opposed to the rules-based international order are the treaty organizations that make up international laws. And thus, because there is no ultimate arbitrator between states, states operate according to their national interest. Furthermore, they divided states into revisionist states, which wish to change the status quo, and status quo states, which wish to maintain it. They also saw power as driving all human interaction, and thus all things masked as power should be taken as a power grab. This is true for Morgenthau. This is also true for the ex-Marxist James Burnham, who the Machiavellians also shares this classical realist view of both human nature and of the nature of the state. Now, classical realists generally saw multipolarity as the default state of play in international relations, and one that could be actually quite stable. Why did they view it as stable is a little bit more complicated to get into, but perhaps we should. Morgenthau and Carr both argued that polarity poles force big states to gain power through alliances and petty wars, but not to directly challenge other powers. Thus, this led to a stable, if slightly war-prone, international system that only when unbalances are introduced between the multiple poles does this become a flashpoint. Neo-realist emerged in the 1970s after behavioralism was seen to win in the social sciences. While today we see as cognitivism driving our discussions of what human beings are, behavioralism is still actually the assumption for actions of state. Thus, neo-realist thought that the ultimate function of a state is its own self-perpetuation, its own survival. And there were two kinds of neo-realists: defensive neo-realist and offensive neo-realist. The defensive neo-realist view security and maintenance of the state as a stable system as the primary driver of state equilibrium and status quo politics. Whereas offensive neo-realists see the acquisition of power as the driving force. Fareed Zakaria, as aforementioned, and one of the people who popularized this idea of multipolarity, actually sees American realism as operating on an offensive neo-realist basis, which is always trying to expand power when opportunities arise. Now, Dugin's use of multipolarity, and that somehow, and in a way that is not obvious, leads to its incorporation into Marxism, a ideology which Duginism sees as outmoded and outdated, is actually quite interesting. Because structural anti-imperialism is implied in this view, and the legitimacy of other states outside of American hegemony. And against that, leftists have, both in their Marxist and non-Marxist form, opposed American hegemony for most of the 20th century. The overlap makes a lot of sense, but the goals are different. Anti-imperialism, as we understand it, is older than Marxism. John A. Hobson's really the first theoretician of this, and he saw imperialism as developing from capitalism, but fundamentally separate from it. Thus having macroeconomic implications, as opposed to just colonialism or ancient state imperialism. Lenin disagreed with Hobson on one thing. Instead of removing capitalism's complicity in this, Lenin says that this is inevitable as profitability decreases and more state involvement increases to maintain profitability in the capitalist system. So states become stronger and profitability decreases. Where can we find profitability? By primitive, so-called primitive accumulation, which is through both subjugating smaller states and regions for raw materials, forcing them into the market at unfair leverage trade, and dumping surplus production onto those markets, collapsing local markets. This is what Lenin thought the economic or microeconomic character of imperialism was. Lenin's response to this led to revolutionary defeatism, which was the idea that all wars between states, particularly great power states, should be pivoted into civil wars between classes. This was a position first developed at the Zimmerwald Conference in response to the Second International's inability to maintain its prior position that we should not support wars between capitalist or bourgeois states. Lenin took this very far. And letters about Kautsky later on, Lenin, for example, was to go so far as to say that we should not support Serbian nationalism, which would generally be a good thing for breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but that because it would strengthen the Russian Empire, this was not worth doing and had to wait for a different time period for socialist support. So Lenin, for example, did see national liberation as a good, but that sometimes you had to forego it in the context it would strengthen another empire over another. He argued against Kautsky, who maintained that while the position of the SPD during World War I was a deviation, that perhaps Serbian nationalism was worth fighting the British Empire over. After all, the British Empire were the greater empire than the Russians are the Austro-Hungarians. But Lenin chastised Kautsky for this, calling this opportunism. This is a very different nature than multipolarity. In fact, Lenin's assumptions about capitalist imperialism exist in a multipolar context. A unipolar world is more like Kautsky's definition of super imperialism, where capitalist powers act multilaterally to maintain their own productive capacity, which is what happened after World War II and the development of the nuclear bomb. What Lenin was right about in 1914, Kautsky was right about in 1952. So what does this have to do with multipolarity? Well, we see they're fundamentally different things with fundamentally different descriptions. Realists have generally not loved multipolarity, although classical realists thought it was the default system and probably could be stable if handled the correct way. Neo-realists see the competition of state survival leading to more and more violence. So while neo-realism emerged in international relations, rejecting any concept of human nature in favor of structural analysis, and the assumption that systems where this only real function was self-preservation, they also argued that chain ganging and buck passing would be common in a multipolar scenario. Chain ganging meaning allies get drawn into unprovoked and unwise wars by allegiance partners, and that there's competition between multipolar empires to attract client states from far away to remove them from the influence of immediate poles. So there's competition for like Russian influence in South America, Chinese influence in Africa, American influence in Southeast Asia, etc., are actually pulls to weaken another pole in the competition between the poles. Plus, chain ganging means that alliances can be drawn that get people into wars that are not in the interest of lesser alliance members. Buck passing, which is when states do not experience an immediate proximate threat, they do not balance against other threatening powers and hope they can carry the cost of balancing against the threat, is often also a feature, according to neo-realists, of multipolarity. John Mearsheimer, again, argues that buck passing is more common in multipolar systems than in bipolar systems. Bipolar systems make direct conflict inevitable, but direct conflict that is military unlikely, because the threats of two roughly equal powers mean that one cannot annihilate the other or use small states to peel one person off of the other side in an effective way. In fact, Mearsheimer argues that the bipolar world, not the multipolar and not the unipolar, is actually the most stable world. Now, you will notice another difference between Marxism and international relations theory is the stability of units in the system. Marxism is absolutely not concerned about that. But bipolarity and multipolarity and unipolarity do speak a polyglot language. Dugin uses them differently from Fareed Zakaria. Fareed Zakaria uses them differently from the neo-realist, at least the defensive neo-realist, and all of them use it differently from the classical realists such as Hans Morgenthau and E.H. Carr. So why so many Marxists believe in a multipolar world? Well, a multipolar world is not a world without great power states with massive spheres of influence and even civilizational content. And in some ways, one of the things about the current debate about multipolarity that has reincorporated the worldview of Samuel Huntington and those who view direct force as basically the thing that arbitrates between civilizations and civilizational conflict being inevitable and even necessary. Now let's go back to the difference between multipolarity and multilateralism. Multilateralism is a view that small powers will join with bigger powers in powerful coalitions to act together. Unilateralism is when great states act on their own accord in the anarchy of the world system. Thus, American hegemony actually destroyed its ability to use its rules-based international order by acting unilaterally, alienating small states, and also the treaties which back up the system of allegiances that create international law. International law is a set of voluntary treaties to which states hold themselves, as there is no actual governing organization of the planet to enforce the law. In this sense, you could have multilateral multipolarities and unilateral multipolarities. They aren't the same thing. They're not describing the same points in the international system. And all of these remove the economy from political economy. This is just purely political calculation. Very different from imperialism and the Lenin or Marx view, which is very much tied into economic systems and the social reproduction of the world beyond just the maintenance of states. Now, the fracturing of the American empire when it abandoned its multilateral institutions for unilateral ones in a bit of hubris after 9/11, during its triumphant period after the end of bipolarity during the Cold War, has been seen as actually the beginning of the end of American hegemonic dominance. But even under multipolar systems, unless you completely destroy the United States, which, yes, some multipolar people want to do, American power is just one amongst many and still very strong. Now, Dugin wishes to use this history from classical realism. And in fact, while he doesn't explicitly say it, his appeal is to classical realism. Because remember, classical realists see multipolarity as the natural order of things and tie this to Huntington civilizational politics and the idea of the Ruski Mir. And of course, this would be opposed to the American and capitalist world order, but not in a way that in any way resembles anything which Marxism historically talks about. One can see this as one of many kinds of conservative or reactionary anti-imperialisms. But multipolarity in and of itself does not have political content. It is just describing the number of great powers that exist in a system at the same time. It can go many, many different ways. There's no, since the default position of state development in human history is actually a multipolar one, particularly at the world scale, with cores and peripheries being multiple and not unilateral, it becomes very clear that, of course, this can go a bunch of different ways. You can have peaceful and cooperative multilateral multipolarity. You can have multipolarity where all states are in decline. You can have multipolarity with some states are able to gain power over others, etc. But it is a very unstable form of governance. That Marxist have now adopted this framework means that they have largely abandoned proper political economy, so to speak. Although there are some people who have tried to come up with a concept of geopolitical economy. I think you can look at Ben Norton and, to a lesser degree, the proto-MMT theorist Michael Hudson as a key example of this. So I'm not saying that multipolarity is useless or it's inherently negative or it even has any political content whatsoever. It's a description of the relationship of great powers in a world system. Now, if we have a socialist view, all these world systems are still largely subordinated to the international market. Even non-capitalist internal economies still operate in a capitalist global economy. And because of this, focusing on geopolitics is in some ways easier than figuring out the complicated relationships of geopolitical economy. That does not invalidate multipolarity as a descriptor of politics and centers of power, but it does mean that it is not our primary concern. And for those of you who project positive political content onto a description of the number of hegemons in the world system, you are doing work that is not implied in the concept. And to deny the history of the concept because the way people currently use the word does not actually comport with it, although the way people currently use the word is somewhere between what is meant by classical realist geopolitics and international relations and what is meant by anti-imperialism. It is neither completely one or the other. Nonetheless, it is fundamentally projection on the vagaries of a word that is just a descriptor of power relations to have a positive politics within it. That is something you must contest and must emerge around the discourses of the concept in a heteroglottic polyglot way. So, and by no means do I finalize the meaning of multipolarity by telling you its history, but I do point this out by saying that it is an innovation to bring this into Marxism that is fundamentally new, and reading it as the same thing as the Zimmerwald left or Lenin's anti-imperialism is not honest to the history of the concept. All right, thank you. Continue nailing it down so you understand the world.